and welcome back to my channel. So as you can see today, I'm not actually in my library. I thought that we might need a little bit of a change of scenery just for this series. So today we will be doing, I believe this is part 4. I think it's part 4. Episode 4 of my Dissecting Gothic Lit series. And today I will be talking about Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I know that this is a super classic novel, but I didn't read it until this year. I actually did a buddy read earlier this year with Find Me in the Footnotes, and I fell head over heels in love with this. I really thought this was going to be more of like a Jane Austen style romance, and while it is, and it also really isn't. It's very dark, it's very macabre, and it paves the way for a lot of feminism in writing, especially in horror. And also a lot of like traditional horror tropes that we see nowadays in the media kind of everywhere. So Charlotte Bronte initially released Jane Eyre under the pen name Currer Bell, I think that's how you say it, in 1847. It was a huge deal because it was one of the first stories to really focus on the like moral development of a character that was told through a first-person narrative. So we meet Jane and we see her throughout 5 main stages of her life, starting with her early childhood, and then we go all the way up until she is old enough to get married and basically make a life for herself. And a lot of the story in traditional Gothic fashion is told based on what locations and sprawling manners she happens to be in. Oh, before I really dive into this, I guess I should say this, even though if you're watching episode 4 now, then you probably know this, but this is going to have a lot of spoilers. My Dissecting Gothic Lit series really does go in through the entire novel and pull out not only the plot, but a lot of the overarching themes, as well as a lot of history behind the novel. So there will be a lot of spoilers in this, so please, if you have not read Jane Eyre, I highly suggest reading it and then maybe coming back and watching this video after you've read it, because I will be spoiling a lot of things in this video and a lot of big twists in the plot. But yes, so this novel is told through stages of Jane's life. We initially meet her, I think she's about 10 years old, and she has been orphaned and taken in by her uncle's family, the Reeves. She's living at Gateshead Hall, but her uncle has died, and on his deathbed he has asked his wife to promise that he will look after Jane and kind of raise her as one of her own. Mrs. Reed is not about that at all. She has her own 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and she thinks of Jane kind of as low class because I believe it's Jane's mother married someone beneath her class. So even though Jane's uncle is related to her by blood, Jane's aunt, Mrs. Reed, does not view her as a member of the family because Jane's father was of a poorer class. So she is pretty discriminated against very heavily while she is growing up. And just really kind of made out to be a servant at the age of 10. There's a scene where finally, after being put down over and over and basically bullied and hurt by her cousins, physically hurt and abused by her cousins, when her aunt is basically punishing her, she kind of tells her aunt off. Now, by standing up to her aunt, we see this first moment of vivacity in Jane, as well as her courage, but she is punished very severely for it. She's sent to what is known as the Red Room, which I believe is the room that her uncle died in, and while she is in there, she kind of has a panic attack because she believes that she sees his ghost. While ghosts are not going to be a heavy factor in this story, the sighting of this ghost and this panic attack that she has in the Red Room is definitely one of the things that sets the tone right off the bat of this being a Gothic novel. While it is not necessarily a horror novel, this is definitely a novel with a lot of dark undertones and some scary figures in it. I did really enjoy the ghost scene in the Red Room. It's very cool, and to watch Jane's reaction to it is a very endearing scene because she is so scared, even though in reality, if there is a ghost, it would be her loving and caring uncle. So I found that really interesting that she's so terrified of the ghost, even though it probably is one of the only people who did care about her during her life. So we move from her kind of morbid childhood with the Reeds to boarding school. Mrs. Reed is so fed up with dealing with Jane, especially now that Jane is standing up to her, that she sends her to a boarding school. And she is sent to Lowood boarding school under the story to like the headmaster that she is a liar, that she is deceitful. And this really bothers Jane because Jane does not think she is a liar. This is a fabrication that Mrs. Reed has basically told the headmaster to kind of get a reason as to why she should be put in this school. Unfortunately, this rumor does follow her to boarding school, and she is fully humiliated by the headmaster for being a deceitful and a liar. Luckily, she does have an amazing teacher who does clear her name. And her name is Miss Temple. Miss Temple does become this big role model for Jane, not only in childhood but later in life. I feel she does live up to the example that Miss Temple sets for her, as well as Helen Burns. Now, the story of Helen Burns is one of the most tragic stories that we get in this novel. Helen Burns is very morally directed, I would say. She's kind of this beacon of like the ideal Christian standard, and she does end up taking punishment for things that Jane doesn't feel she should be punished for, but Helen kind of explains like, these are like my sins to atone for, this is what I have done, so I must bear the burden of my actions. And we see Jane's pushback from this, which I find very, very interesting, because we meet Jane with this kind of initial attitude of her feelings of what is just doesn't always fit with the moral standard. And as she grows older, those two lines kind of start to converge and become one, and then sort of diverge again. So I think this kind of berating of Jane's ideology and the influences around her is very, very important. And Helen Burns is definitely that very first figure to really show her kind of a moral guide, especially in stark contrast to Mrs. Reed, who calls her a liar and has her labeled a liar when in reality Mrs. Reed is the liar. So unfortunately for Helen Burns, we get this really, really tragic scene where after they build up this beautiful friendship together, Helen dies of consumption, and she dies in this very beautiful, sad scene where Jane sneaks into the sick room that she is in, which I believe is Mrs. Temple's room, and lies down next to her as Helen breathes her last breath. However, again, Helen does serve as this tragic figure, but also beautiful role model for Jane throughout the rest of her life. Luckily for Jane, she spends the next, I believe, 8 years at Lowood, both as a student and then 2 years as a teacher, flourishing. And she has a very, very good life, even though she's kind of in this poor, rundown boarding school and has no family that will claim her. She does seem to be happy and successful there. Once she feels that things have grown stagnant at Lowood, she does then apply for a governess job. So she accepts this position as the governess of Thornfield Hall, and when she is there, she finds out that she's going to be the governess of this girl named Adele Varens, who speaks primarily French. Luckily, because Jane Eyre is so well educated thanks to Lowood, she can speak French as well as English and does become her teacher as well as her mentor and sort of like a maternal figure to Adele. She's not really sure of Adele's relationship to the master of the home. It's very unclear for a large portion of the book whether Adele is his daughter or not. You will find out that it seems most likely that Adele is not Edward Rochester's daughter. However, he is able to take over this very father-like figure for her, even though he also becomes sort of this absent father and free spirit. He does care about her, way more so than Mrs. Reed ever cared about Jane. And I think Adele's relationship with both Jane Eyre as well as Mr. Rochester is supposed to reflect a better life for like an orphan than the one that Jane had. Even though she doesn't have the grandeur that you would expect from the supposed daughter of a high-class gentleman, she does have a much nicer, much cushier, much more loved and respected life than Jane did as a child. So Jane wonders about the house, about who the owner could be. He's very, very, very rarely there. And one day she does accidentally meet him as he is riding back to Thornfield Hall and she is walking into town. he falls off his horse and she helps him. When she returns to the house later that evening, she does discover that the man that she helped happens to be the master of the house that she works for. This is very interesting because this, again, parallels the scene that's going to happen later on in the novel when Jane is in need and out in the wilderness and then will be helped by St. John, or St. John. I think it's pronounced St. John. I'm not sure. It's spelled St. John, though. And he helps her. So there is this kind of flip. And from one person helping the other, we do get this kind of strange love story that emerges out of each. One obviously being the true love story and one being kind of a toxic love story of necessity. And I think it's really interesting to see the two paralleled together. So Thornfield Hall is our Gothic manor. It is very, very spooky. It is not filled with a ghost, but it is filled with a strange, haunting laughter of the supposedly mentally disturbed Grace Poole, as well as someone who is sneaking into rooms and lighting Mr. Rochester's bed on fire, attacking the traveler and visitor Mr. Mason in his sleep, and at one point even tearing up the veil in Jane's room. This atmosphere is carried throughout a large portion of Thornfield as this kind of strange presence that is in the house that seems very unexplained. Mr. Rochester writes it off again as the mental disturbance of Grace Poole, seemingly because that is the story that Jane has heard rumored and attached to. However, almost everybody in the house that works there, as well as Mr. Rochester, seems to be aware of what it actually is, yet they all willingly lead Jane astray. Now, I find this very, very questionable. Now, I understand it is to protect Mr. Rochester's reputation, especially because when we discover the twist and what this laughing is and this kind of ghoul in the night, it brings up a lot of questionable flaws with Mr. Rochester's character, which we are not quite sure if it is directly his own personal flaw or if it is the flaws of many, many people combined to bring this situation together. But at the end of the day, this is kind of this, like, the skeletons in the closet that the help will help hide for the corrupt master. There is definitely a lot of tones, and it also shows like the lack of morality that Mr. Rochester has, especially in contrast to Jane, somebody who is so set in doing what is just. And obviously Mr. Rochester's decisions are not just. They are very unfair to both Jane as well as the other woman involved. So while all of this is going on, Mr. Rochester's all of a sudden looking for a wife. He begins to court Ingram Blanche, who really reminds me of the titular Rebecca in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. She seems very corrupt, very evil, very sinister, but a lot of that doesn't come to fruition because in the end, Mr. Rochester does kind of dangle his romance with Ingram in front of Jane, kind of to coax Jane to agree to be his wife. Now, there's definitely some questions there of him kind of baiting her that again, he is this morally ambiguous figure, but he's also pulling Jane out of her comfort zone and showing her that, yes, you can be a part of high society even though you are supposedly lower born. And while his methods are questionable, Jane does love him. He does seemingly love her. They are set to be married, and on the night of their wedding, Jane wakes up to a very distraught-looking woman tearing up her wedding veil. If that is not an omen, I don't know what is. And it does serve to be a very, very negative thing for Jane, for as she is walking down the aisle, she is stopped by Mr. Mason and a lawyer who reveal that Mr. Rochester cannot marry Jane because he is already married. So they reveal that Grace Poole is actually not the one making all of the disturbances in Thornfield Hall, and is actually Mr. Rochester's first wife, Bertha, who has mentally declined. It's very unclear of what happened, but was mentally unstable, and he was kind of tricked into marrying her under false pretenses, supposedly. And after he was with her, realize that there was something very, very wrong with her. She is very violent, she is very aggressive, and she does escape Grace Poole's care, who is her caretaker, and wreaks havoc across Thornfield Manor, thus, lighting Mr. Rochester's bed on fire, attacking her brother, Mr. Mason, and ripping up Jane's veil out of jealousy. Now, when Jane learns this and finally sees Bertha with her own eyes, she is very distraught, as one would be, doesn't quite know what to do, and has kind of this more pivotal moral dilemma that she must face. Does she stay with Rochester even though she has been lied to and deceived? Or does she lose this love of her life and find something more true and meaningful? And at this point, she does leave, and she leaves without saying goodbye, and pretty much leaves without anything. She just straight up goes. And one of the big things about Jane is, again, there is this division in class. She's kind of in between high class and low class because of her upbringing, as well as who her parents are and her position in Thornfield. And she doesn't want Mr. Rochester to ever be able to hold the fact that he is wealthy and powerful above her. She doesn't want to be his plaything. She doesn't want to be just the wife in the corner, especially now that she's seen how he can just put Bertha away. She wants to be her own independent woman on an equal footing with Rochester. And since he cannot offer that, that definitely helps her in her choice to flee. Now, just a funny aside, I did not realize the hidden monster in the attic trope was from Jane Eyre originally. I remember the first time I saw it, I was watching a Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, and you found out that Bart had a secret twin, and he was kept in the attic, and it was just 100% a reference to Jane Eyre, and I never even realized it. I mean, The Simpsons reference so much literature that it shouldn't surprise me. The first time I ever heard The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe was from The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, so they're always ahead of their game. But yeah, so that trope, which we have seen now constantly, if you've seen *Malignant*, maybe you know what I'm talking about. I hope that doesn't ruin anything. But yes, so this is a trope that is still continuously used today in horror, and obviously originated in Jane Eyre. So from Thornfield Hall, Jane basically goes and just wanders the countryside. She wastes all of her money trying to escape Thornfield and is destitute and homeless for several days. And she stumbles upon this house and basically begs to be let in. She is initially turned away by the housekeeper, but as she is being turned away, this man, St. John, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. The notes of my book said it was pronounced St. John, but it is spelled St. John. St. John Rivers shows up, I believe he's a pastor, and lets her in. And this is where we see her once again flourish in her new life at the Moore House. While she is there, she is offered a position as a school teacher working in the town that St. John oversees. She creates a bond with his two sisters and finds out that she did have a very wealthy uncle who left her all of his fortune, conveniently. And it turns out, on top of that, that not only did he leave her all of the fortune, but she happens to be related to the family that has taken her in at the Moore House. I forget the exact relation, I think they might be cousins, but oddly, her uncle left them out of the will, and she feels guilty and then divides the money from the will up between all four of them, which is great. She is flourishing, she is having a happy and great life there, until St. John is like, hey, I'm gonna go out to India, and I think you should be my wife and help me just convert a bunch of people and do the work of God. And Jane's like, I mean, that's not really my calling in life, and I'm not romantically in love with you at all, so if you want me to go, I will totally go as your friend. You can even say I'm your sister so it doesn't look scandalous that we are traveling together, but I don't want to marry you. And this pisses St. John off quite a lot. Now, St. John is again the moral opposite of Mr. Rochester. He is by nature a religious man, but he's a religious man who is extremely selfish and set in his own kind of self-righteous, prideful ways, whereas Rochester, who, I don't think I said this before, is consistently not called an attractive man. He is liked for his money, but he is not an attractive man. And since Jane never liked him for his money, you get the the idea that she loved him for his personality, apart from his moral compass, which he has been very open about is very questionable. He has had mistresses, he had a secret wife, he has done a lot of scandalous things, but seems at the core to be a very, very good person. Where we have St. John, who again is this very self-righteous, prideful, I don't want to say corrupt, but definitely a dislikable main character who is trying to get Jane to marry him for his own selfish, self-serving purposes, whereas Rochester wanted her to marry him because he loved her. Now, as all of this is happening, she hears Rochester calling her in the middle of the night, and she takes this as this sign that she needs to return and find him. She's had a lot of good things happen to her recently, the coming of money, she kind of reconciles with her aunt, and a bunch of just things to really build her up as a person. Now she's no longer a girl, she is this very well-formed, developed woman. She has her own fortune, she has her own career, she knows what she wants to do and who she is, and has now elevated herself out of that middle ground of class. So now Rochester doesn't have any kind of hold over her that she was scared of from the beginning. So she returns to Thornfield Hall, where she finds out that it has been completely destroyed in a fire, that Bertha set it to fire, and as Rochester was trying to save everyone, she fell to her death. She did jump off of the building. He was not able to save her, I believe. But in his attempts to save people, he did get blinded and disfigured. So he has gone off to live at a little countryside manor where Jane goes and approaches him. They rekindle their love. She chooses to be with him. You find out that he has been devastated ever since she left. And now because they are both on the same class ground, she has proven her independence, proven herself to herself. She can be with the man that she loves for him. And luckily, all of the complications of him having a wife have conveniently fallen off the roof. And then you find out at the end, I don't know why it ends on this, but that St. John goes and kind of dies in misery and self-righteousness. And she would have ended up not happy. Like, she would have ended up over there with him, miserable, sick, unhappy, trying to do this facade of the Lord's work, where in reality now she gets to go be with Rochester. They have a son together. He slowly gains his eyesight back. She nurses him back to health, and they live on equal footing for the rest of their days. So I love this story. I think it's a really, really interesting tale on love and morality. I think that Jane's growth as a person is a very ideal feminist view. She is such a strong, powerful, independent woman and constantly refuses the help and aid of men in order to better herself and do what she wants to do and be who she wants to be. I just think that in the end, her choice is to be with Rochester to make her happy, not out of any kind of need, any kind of like fear or duty. She does it because she wants to, and she loves him. And she has to get to a point where she can prove that. And I think this is something that we never really see, especially in the 1800s, of female characters who have these kind of roles. If you look at something like Dracula, where we have Mina and Lucy, Mina is supposed to be kind of like the pure example, whereas Lucy is kind of the like sex-crazed, corrupted soul. But they're both very, very flat characters. They have no independence. Their whole life definition is based off of Lucy marrying her husband, I forget what his name is Arthur, and Mina's attachment to Jonathan Harker. We see so many times where there really isn't where there isn't anything left to the Victorian woman apart from being what their husband and society builds them up to be. And Jane from the very get-go says no. She stands up to Mrs. Reed. She stands up to being a liar when she's at Lowood. She leaves Thornfield to prove to herself that she does not need the man's love and his reputation and his money to be who she wants to be. She says no to St. John because he is not what she's looking for in life, even though society and reputations and financially everything is saying you should have made the opposite decision. But in the end, she gets the best possible outcome. And I think by comparing St. John's life's outcome to Jane's life outcome shows just how much her personal decisions led her to the happiness that she so well deserves. And this is just such a breath of fresh air to get from a Victorian novel. I mean, like, I feel like we never see that. I feel like women are always such one-dimensional characters, or they're just driven by small things like, I need to get married, I need to find a husband, like, I need to look good in society. And in this, Jane Eyre says no to all of it, and just such a shining example. And even now in 2021, I will read books where men can't write a woman this strongly. And you look at something that was written in 1847 that was supposedly written by a man when it came out. And I mean, that must have been scandalous of a man writing a woman this strongly. So, like, obviously it had to be written by a woman secretly. But I just found it absolutely fascinating. And I think Jane Eyre is one of those books that if you've never read it, you absolutely should. It is a great romance. I'm not really into romance, but I think it is dark and beautiful and brooding, and just absolutely lovely. And it is filled with these sprawling estates and these creepy manors. And it is scary at times, and it is shocking at times. And it does such a great job of balancing the Gothic tropes with the romance tropes and making it this very pro-women, beautiful, coming of age story where you don't get a tragic ending. You get the idea that if you do what you feel is right and you feel is just, not just what society tells you is morally correct, you will find happiness. And I think that's such an amazing message, especially for 1847. But yes, so Jane Eyre. This is a 5-star read for me. I was absolutely blown away by this. I think everybody should pick this up. It is a truly unique style of Gothic lit, and I like that it is not just set in one manor, but 4 different manors, and is a true romance story as well. It's very unique. I've never read anything like it. It is so much nicer than Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is so goddamn depressing. This is sad and joyous and amazing, and will just take you on a whirlwind of emotions, and it's just a great, great story. So yes, highly, highly, highly recommend Jane Eyre. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. As always, I post every Monday and Thursday and sometimes Saturdays. If you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below. Let me know what other Gothic lit stories you want me to dissect down in the comments. I am planning on doing Dracula very soon and The Turn of the Screw very, very soon. So be on the lookout for those. As always, thank you guys so much, and I will see you in the next one. Mwah.